Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday, October 3rd, 2019 in our session, our seminar series on edge computing, whether Asia and the United States are going to go in different directions. And for our first of the guest speakers this week, I'm delighted that we can have really one of the very few people in the world who is qualified to talk about not only 5G network technology, but their adoption and all of the different kinds of international things going on about 5G. Our speaker this week is Professor Arogyaswami Paulraj, and Professor Paulraj started off being a really famous inventor in the United States. Actually, he was in the Indian Navy for 30 years. And developed technologies in India. So Professor Paulraj developed the technology that allows multiple cell antennas to be used both at the transmission side and the reception side for wireless communications. And so his work is really a critical part of all cell phone networks now. He's the author of more than 400 research papers. He has written 2 textbooks. He's a co-inventor on 79 U.S. patents. He is in the United States Patent Office Inventors Hall of Fame. He received the Marconi Prize from the Marconi Foundation, and he received the Alexander Graham Bell Prize from the IEEE. So his technical qualifications are absolutely, without question. He has also founded and taken to exit 2 startup companies in the kind of wireless communication space, one of which was acquired by Intel, and one of which was acquired by Broadcom. He has also had a 3rd company, I'm sorry, I missed that one, that was acquired by HPE in 2016. So Professor Paulraj is very active on the international stage. It's really hard to catch him when he's actually at Stanford. We're delighted that you could come by and talk to us about the promise of 5G network. Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, Professor Dasher. Can everybody hear me? Good. It's an honor to be in this seminar. I haven't spoken in this room for many, many years, so thank you for inviting me back. So thank you also for the introduction. Actually, Professor Dash is right. I've been somewhat involved with governments recently, a little bit in the U.S. government, and more recently a lot with Indian government, and also occasionally in Beijing too. So, apart from just dabbling a little bit in the valley, but my startup days are over. So today's talk is about, there's no technology in my today's talk. It's all about what's happening in 5G. Let's call it the politics of 5G. And 5G is just beginning to happen. So I'll give you an idea of what's going on, where it's going, what the challenges might be, and so on and so forth. So I think most of us are overloaded with 5G. It seems to be there everywhere. It's on 60 Minutes. It's in PBS. It's in the New York Times. So I guess all of you heard of it a million times. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about probably a view from somebody who's sort of involved with these things at partly at the technology level, partly at the political level. So I hope I'll be able to transmit some new new information to you. And thank you for coming. Let me start by saying that what's the killer app really? And the killer app really is wireless. Now, wireless has made an incredible impact on our country, on the world. And in a personal wireless, today we have smartphones, but we started off with these analog phones some years ago. When I landed at Stanford in '91, for many years I never had a phone, but I invented a technology called MIMO. Anybody has heard of MIMO? M-I-M-O? Yeah, it's every time you use your phone now, you're using MIMO, either Wi-Fi or an LTE. So it's a very fundamental technology, but people used to always kid me saying you don't have a phone. But nevertheless, right now 98% of the world's population have a phone, and about 40% have a smartphone today. And of course, I remember in India, I spent a lot of my time in India. And when I left India in 91, we had less than 30 million phones. We were probably about 800 million people. There's 30 million phones, so its penetration was less than 5%. And cellular came around 1990, 98, 99. It started moving. Within 10 years, we were at 98%. So we went from 5% to 98% within 10 years. So that was a transformation in India, but it happened in China, in Africa, and certainly in the United States too. And there's always a story which I would like to repeat. There was a company called Anderson Consulting Company, which was so back in the 1980s, there were cell phones, but they were car phones. They were basically either a piece of electronics back of the dicky of your car or in a bag. You would put it in the front seat, plug it into the cigarette lighter, and pick up and make a call. And they were pretty expensive. So I think AT&T commissioned Anderson to do a survey of what will be the number of cell phones cell phones in the US by year 2000, end of that millennia. And they predicted it was 1 million phones. We were actually at more than 100 million. So things can go badly wrong. So the value of phones is because mobility, I mean, all these are pretty, for most of the young people, it is completely obvious, but it wasn't so obvious for the older guys like me. Ease of access, you can see it anytime, anywhere. The reach, it reaches the remotest part of India or Africa. Everybody in the world today has a phone, can get at least voice connectivity. Scalability, you can drive it, we can build, we support 7 billion people. Ease of deployment, this is an important thing. I remember I was writing papers about it. If you're doing a wired network, you've got to run a wire to every home, and maybe some people may not even subscribe to that connection for whatever reason. So a lot of dead infrastructure. Well, cell phones are you put up a tower, each guy buys his own phone, so there's a much more, the deployment is far faster in phones and much lower cost. I think the cost of a wired access in the US was hard to say, but I think it was something like close to $1,000. Phones brought it down dramatically by a factor of 10 or 20 times. So it's been a huge, huge benefit. So 5G will bring these and more benefits to sensors, actuators, machines, and that will enable new things, much better data analytics, AI, and ultimately Industry 4.0. So the 5G is going to bring all these wonderful benefits from voice or phone access to objects, sensors, actuators, IoT, machines, and so on and so forth. So that's the big picture on 5G. So I wrote a report for the government of India on 5G, and this picture is from that report. So basically, 2G was a basic phone. I need to remember all these, you buy a phone, all these technologies are still inside them, except 5G may not be yet that popular in the US, but 2, 3, and 4G, every 4G phone has all these systems. So these things never seem to go away. But 2G was just a basic phone, and I think I finally bought a phone around 1998, the first time. And Stanford didn't reimburse phones those days. Then the 3G phones, which kind of feature phones, did some email, and I used to have my first company, I remember having a BlackBerry and things like that. And 4G was, it really brought in the concept of smartphones, Android, and the Apple iOS systems. And then, of course, now data became much, much better, faster, and you can do a lot more things with phones, and this is what we have today. 5G is also another G, so it's more speed. All these things sort of added functionality to phones. 5G will do that, of course, but also many, many other things, many other applications, which I'll talk about, IoT and transportation, manufacturing, and so on. So there's a whole lot of new applications. So it's much more than another G. So much of the excitement of 5G is because the top layer. It can do many more things. I'll talk quite a lot about that. But that's why 5G has so much of stuff behind it. And there's and I should also say that usually when 2G was around, when 3G was coming, everybody said we don't need another G. Maybe it'll do very little. And I remember 4G, I was deeply involved with 4G. I had 2 companies in the area. And I was part of the technology because MIMO, which is the fundamental to it, I was inventor. People didn't think 4G will do anything much. They think it's just a way of selling more phones, but transformed everybody's lives. There's no way one can one can even think of a world without 4G today. So 5G, on the other hand, has got a lot of hype behind it. First time we're seeing something where people are saying that this is going to be really big. So let's see if it plays out. So this is another busy slide, and it's got from 5G Americas. So sort of talks about all that 5G might do. It's a transformational fabric, and if you look at most of the reports from the United Nations, IEEE, they all talk about how transformational 5G will be. It's all in the future, and I think it'll probably fulfill its promise. But there are three buckets in 5G. It's actually not right, not extreme, but enhanced mobile broadband. Basically, higher speed access to phones and other devices. So it's just like a cellular system, but much higher speed. Second one is massive scale computing. This is like IoT connecting to lots of sensors and actuators, millions of them. And the third one, which is actually the most interesting, is making communications more reliable and low latency. That will enable a lot more new applications. So these are the three important buckets. Let me run through a few of them. If you have enhanced broadband, certainly you can certainly do much better video calling and virtual meetings. And it turns out that today, most US homes, I'm on campus, I have fiber. Most of us don't have fiber in homes. And with DSL or with cable, it can't hard to cross 100 megabits in a real reasonable way. But 5G can bring gigabits to your home. So 5G is going to become a big enabler of fixed wireless. And and then, of course, there are verticals here, human to human. So those are virtual reality, video calling, wearables, social networking, public safety. So 5G will enable this along these horizontals. Human to machine, so things like augmented reality, fixed wireless, smart homes, healthcare monitoring. And finally, machine to machine, which is really the big thing. That's going to be much bigger than these two verticals. All kinds of things from video monitoring, mobile cloud computing to industry 4.0. It's going to enable this whole idea of a new form of industry with so-called cyber-physical systems, vehicle-to-vehicle communications, smart agriculture, smart everything. So it's going to be a big thing. So this is a high-level picture of 5G. So let's look at what's happening in standards and deployments. In wireless, it turns out you need standards because phones are made by different people and the infrastructure pieces are made by different people. We want to talk to each other. There will be strict standards. And I remember in 5G, in 5MAX, I was really involved with 5MAX very deeply. We spent about $50 million building that standard. It might have been 3 feet stack of paper. I think the numbers in 4G were much higher. I would suspect it's hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's a whole process by which large teams, thousands of people meet every month all over the world and build a standard. It's full of competitive issues, standard essential patterns. It's a very big game. But lots of ideas come in, and the best ideas get chosen. So these standards are very complex, but also extremely capable because they deliver all these services. So the 5G, the standards started with release 13. Up to release 12 was LTE. So release 13, release 14, release 15, release 16. So release 15 has been now finally finalized, I think a few months ago. Release 16 is now in process. And that thing called early drops, that means the initial drops of the standard, but I think it'll get only finalized end of 2020. So that's a little optimistic. So I think it's delayed to end of 2020. There's one more release called release 17, which is in preparation. So that will start fairly soon, but probably will get pushed out to 2021. Now, so that's the standard. So release 16 is now active. The monthly meetings all over the world, they keep running around. And if you go to, I've been to a few of these, you'll find several thousands of people. And so the deployments have just started. Phase 1, which is the enhanced mobile broadband, which is basically another G, that has started. I'll talk about who's doing what, but fundamentally it's China is leading the game here with the maximum high-speed, with the most deployments. United States is a strong follower-up. Japan, South Korea, I think these are the 4 big names. Others, and Europe and others will probably be a little later. I wanted to mention that in 4G, 4G was largely, the key ideas came from United States. So 4G, we really led the, US led the world. In 5G, we all of us know that on the infrastructure side, Huawei has actually become the leader. And in deployment, US led China by about 2 or 3 years. But in deployment in 5G, I think China is going to lead the United States. So that has flipped. So that's EMBB deployment. The phase 2 and phase 3 are these massive connectivity and ultra reliable, low latency communications. They are not even, the standard's not yet been completely frozen. So they're, I'm optimistic to say 21, 22, maybe a little longer. So right now, what's be a big, very beginning of EMBB, the other 2 parts of the probably more important pieces are not yet started. So technology evolution, just to put 5G in perspective, 1G was analog, and the first 1G service was around 1984, 85. There were the car phones. You had these electronics in cars or bag phones, and it really changed thanks to the development of a smartphone, of the handheld phone. Till then you were stuck to the car through a big bag. And that was one of the well-known names behind that is Marty Cooper, who I've actually did a company with them at one time. So that idea of having a handheld phone really changed the world. But 1G was there, and then it was an analog system, FM modulation. Then 2G came around late 1980s, but actually deployment started a little later. And it came from then we went digital. First, it's all analog modulation, analog system, went digital after 2G. And 2G and 3G were circuit switched. That means you set up a line and it remained with you. The whole circuit remained with you till the call was torn down. And the initial 2G system, GSM, was a TDMA system. You would slice up time and give each time slice to a different person, to a different phone. And then we had CDMA, where you would actually do it's called spreading code and give a unique code to every person. There was a big fight between TDMA and CDMA, and I think in this room, there were standing fights on that issue. I remember because Ericsson was one camp and Qualcomm was another camp. So there was a lot went on in Stanford those days, about 25 years ago, around those 2 battles. Of course, those technologies are long gone, so those battles are dead. But CDMA was the 3G system. And then 4G brought in a new technology, and I was involved with both those pieces. Idea of OFDM, I'll talk about it later, was invented actually in Bell Labs in 1960s. And MIMO was my patent. So MIMO-OFDMA, that combination became the key technology for 4G. It's going to be in 5G. It's already in 5G. It's part of Wi-Fi now. So it's a very, very fundamental approach to communications, and it may never go away. It's the other earlier systems sort of disappeared. So MIMO-OFDMA was a very, very fundamental advance, and I had a lot to play in that whole thing. This goes back to 1998, 99, 2000. And we brought in smartphones. And then, because there's data, we got packet switched. So these were data circuits, packet switched. And 5G is exactly the same thing, MIMO-OFDMA. We made it a little more flexible, otherwise not that much changes, some weighting, I'll mention that later. Then another G, more smartphones, but also new things, IoT and low latency, ultra reliable stuff. So this is a big picture of technology evolution. And if the complexity of analog systems was, well, let's say, a 2-inch thick stack of paper, 5G will probably be a 10-foot stack of paper. It's enormously complex systems. And Anybody who hasn't taken part in these standards will really then realize how complicated these things are. So what about technology lifespans? 1G probably really began to get deployed around 1919, and people could buy phones and use them. It sort of lasted for about almost 15 years. 2G started around, I would say, late 90s, and that's GSM, and that's still around. That's not gone. So it may never go, in my opinion, but it's sort of expected by 2025 or so, it'll sort of taper off. But I would say for 3 or 4 billion people in this world only have 2G access. So it's still very critical in Africa and Asia, certainly Africa and in India and other places. 3G came as to trying to give better speed, technically make it more efficient, getting more calls. It sort of evolved a little bit into data, and they really started deploying around 2005. It didn't last that long because it was delayed initially because of lack of phones, no phones available. And then when 4G was so much better, it kind of dying a very fast death now. So I don't think it'll have a full 15-year or 20-year lifetime. So 4G now is the ruling technology, which all of us have. I don't know, 5G hasn't come to San Jose, so San Francisco. So 4G is the ruling technology, and it's going to be gone. It became, in US, really began to grow around 2012, 13. And now it's got large penetration, and it'll probably be around for another 25 years. It's going to be last time. And 5G is just beginning, and 5G will go on to probably till 2040. So these things take a long time to grow and mature. So that's a big picture on technology lifespans. The thing is that any phone you buy today, if you buy a 5G phone, they have 5, 4, 3, and 2G. And the way it works is, if you get 5G access, you go on 5G because it's fastest. You don't get that, you drop to 4G. You don't get that, you drop to 3G. And you don't get that, you go back to 2G. So these phones do all those things. It's called multi-rad. Okay. So what are the barriers to getting these revolutions launched? And in the case of enhanced broadband with the 5G, the high-speed 5G, the use case is already there. It's just another phone. Everybody understands what a phone is, so it's a matter of buying a 5G phone. And we're selling 5G phones in the United States from LG and from Samsung. And but generally, around the world, one of the barriers for uptake is spectrum auctions. For example, in India, where I was there last week, we still have an allocated spectrum. So leave alone getting the other thing ready. And there's reasons why spectrum has been delayed, because 5G uses a new spectrum called millimetric band, and governments don't understand the economics of that properly, so it's been delayed. And also availability of phones and devices. So for example, I think Apple still hasn't come up with a phone here. We still have these Samsung and LG phones mostly. And in 3G, for example, even in 4G, there's delays in the deployment because of the lack of devices. It turns out the infrastructure is slightly easier than the phones, but I think in 5G, infrastructure also is going to be more delayed because cells are small, it's going to be more expensive. Therefore, the infrastructure cost is going to be higher, and though Verizon and AT&T do a lot of happy talk about deploying widely, it's going to be very expensive because cells are pretty small. But in general, I would say the auctions, phone device availability, infrastructure, the leader today is China. They are moving very fast. But they are deploying in a band called the 3.5 band. I'll talk about that. So what's new in 5G? Well, certainly new applications, new spectrum. We've gone to a complete new band, so that's a lot of learning to be done there. We're still yet to learn a lot. It's going to be a much denser network, many more cells and network densification. And then the 5G is moving towards a different form of implementations called NFV. The idea is that instead of building specific hardware to run the 5G network, we're just going to use server farms, blades, and just write software on them. And that's called O-RAN. There's a lot happening there. There are hundreds of thousands of companies doing it. But 5G is sort of going to get more softwareized in the way it does things. And it's going to enable things like data analytics, AI, and mobile edge computing, which Professor Dasher talked about, in fact, which is the series that is being launched here. Okay, so the first thing is frequency bands. So 5G has got will come in 3 bands. One is the low frequency band, 700 megahertz. Mid frequency band, this is 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz, sometimes called the CBRS band, or sometimes called sub-6 band. And then the high frequency band, which is the 24, 28, and 39 gigahertz. These are the millimetric band. These are the much, much higher frequencies. Typically, they were never considered useful for cellular, but we have, it's coming in, and it's interesting how it's playing out. So generally, the millimetric band will be used in very large scale, for highly high dense events. Certainly, stadiums will be a great place for it. It could also be used in dense downtowns, pedestrian areas, so when you want lots of speed and lots of capacity. While the mid-frequency bands, which are the blue ones, will support traditional LTE type applications, mobile communications, fixed wireless probably, and actually it turns out high frequency bands are also for fixed wireless, and the high frequency bands are fundamentally for fixed wireless and for these applications. And low frequency bands are for much larger cells and also for IoT. It turns out IoT, the problem with IoT is that these are small devices with button batteries, can last for many, many years. And it turns out lower frequencies can do a better job of getting the penetration done. I'll talk more about that later. So that's the low band is the IoT band. The mid band is traditional 4G type applications. The high band is high-speed access for homes and mobiles and dense areas. And the spectrum, spectrum doesn't get allocated in one shot. It's an iterative process. So every country is trying to add more spectrum. Europe, mid-band, low band, mid-band, high band. United States was one of the leaders in allocating high band spectrum. We're still adding more, but we are the first country in the world to saying we're going to do this, make it happen. There's a lot of skepticism. We're going to make it happen. We allocated spectrum, and Verizon and AT&T are deploying that now. I think Sprint will follow up to a point, and some other players too. So essentially, China, Korea, Japan, US are the leading guys in spectrum, in deployment, and but this is a case of progress. But there's one major difference between China and the United States. China, though they did allocate high band spectrum, it's decided, I don't think it's even auctioned them. It's actually moving forward with rolling out in the mid band, that is the 3.5 to 3.4.0 band. US has, on the other hand, allocated high band spectrum, and we're actually rolling out in that band. And there's been a lot of discussion in Washington, which I've been a little bit part of, saying that is that a wise thing to do? Because at high band, you get a lot of bandwidth, but the cells are much smaller. I think it's going to be much slower in deploying, while China will have the advantage of deploying much, much faster because cells are larger. And I have some views that I won't necessarily share with you, but there's this discussion going on. But eventually, both countries will deploy both spectrum. Question is who leads and what first. Okay. In India, where I'm somewhat involved with, I wrote a committee report recommending certain bands, but the government hasn't auctioned them. Okay, so millimetric band is a completely new band. All our phones at the most work in the 2.5 gigahertz band. Now we're talking about 39 gigahertz. And so what's new about that? So the bands are 24, 28, 37, 39. The US, I think, has 3 of those bands. 24 has not yet been auctioned. In general, there's one general hit against millimetric band. High frequency band is there's more loss in the band. That is not true, actually. Photons, fly exactly the same way through normal air, whether it's 1 gigahertz or 30 gigahertz. There's no loss. The real loss comes from a different problem, and I'll explain that. So, but in general, in a millimetric band, you have to have an array of antennas to form a beam. Otherwise, you can't get any range. And therefore, you normally have beam forming, and you tend to form very narrow beams. So in general, you can only talk from the array, from that base station to the phone, there must be a direct line of sight. Sometimes you can have one bounce off. You have a nice tall building, can bounce off that, but you can't have sort of diverse spreading and scattering. That doesn't work very well. So you need to have line of sight or near line of sight. And it turns out there's no real loss in frequencies in free space, but high frequency has a bad rap for saying loss and low range. Where does the low range come from? I'll explain that in the next slide. So in deployment, generally is smaller. You can't get 5 kilometers cells. Its cell sizes are 200 to 400 meters. And it turns out that if you take an Omni antenna at 39 gigahertz, Omni antenna, another Omni at 39 gigahertz, they won't even, when you put the same power, let's say 23 dBm or 40 dBm, you can't even close the link across the table. Don't even go 5 feet. So you want to go further, you have to put an aperture. And my next slide might explain that. A lot of even engineers who know a lot of stuff get this wrong. So there's no real absorption. 39 gigahertz band or 28 will not go through trees. So you'll have 25, 15 dB loss in a tree. But if you don't have trees, foliage, you can fly very, very well, as long as you can do the right thing. The problem here is this: is that why does range fall with frequencies? Suppose this is a phone transmitting 23 dBm, that's quarter watt. Whether it's 1 gigahertz or 30 gigahertz, you're sending out photons, quarter watt of photons. Now, at the base station, you have to have a receiving antenna which has certain beam width, horizontal and vertical. You have to have certain numbers in order to make things work. It turns out that antenna at 1 gigahertz is a pretty large antenna, so it catches a lot more photons. At 39 gigahertz, the antenna is a tiny antenna. It doesn't catch the same photons. So that's the reason why you have a perceived loss. There's no real loss. Antennas are, the apertures to your cross-section catching antennas is small. So the way you do it now is you put a lot of antennas and then catch the same amount of photons, then you do beamforming, and then you can get the ranges. So for example, you have a 20 by 20 centimeter array, and let's say transmitting 33 dBm, that's 20 watts of power. You will find that between 3.5, 24, 28, 39, this is the low band, mid band, and those are high bands. The cell radius doesn't drop that much, 620 meters to 380 meters. But the price of doing that is you need to have a large number of antennas. This is a 5 by 5 array, and you need now 55 by 55. In fact, I think most arrays we build today don't have close to 20 by 20 maximum, I would think. So you may not get 380 meters, you land up with 250 meters or so. But as long as you go through wet trees, lots of foliage, high bands are not necessarily that bad in ranges. But you got to have arrays, and you need to have beamforming. And phones also will now have to have multiple antennas, a small array, and today the phones have that already, so it's possible. Everything works. Okay. Now let me talk first about the G part of 5G. What's happening? Well, it's just another G. It's service to phones, CPEs. Now that's a fixed wireless. Fixed wireless, you either put a little tabletop stuff near your window or sometimes something outside. But fixed wireless is a big part of the use case. Phones, certainly, and 5G phones are now available. I know in Chicago you can use them. And MiFi is the device that most of us have. You jump in on mobile, you jump out on Wi-Fi. Keep in your car, you can. So there are a lot of 5G devices coming where you can actually you can gigabit into that little box, and you can jump out Wi-Fi. So you can the speeds are pretty phenomenal. 2 gigabits to 20 will be pretty small, very very small cells, but you can get very high speeds. Not all of them are available today, but they will get there. LTE typically is up to about 400, 500 megabits, but this one is go to 20 gigabits. It's initially, there's a mode called non-standalone. That means you can't really have a pure 5G phone. You got to make a 5G and a 4G connection simultaneously to deal with all the control issues. So later on, we will go to SA standalone. So that's an evolution that's happening. The new radio is a MIMO-OFDMA radio. It's got a little bit of flexibility around that, and they call it NR, 5G NR radio. And the remarkable thing is that whether you're using 600 megahertz or for 39 gigahertz, it's the same radio. So it's called NR radio. the EMBB part is generally deployed in the mid-band and the high band. China is mid-band, US is in high band. They will, of course, do both eventually. The lower band is used for IoT, I mentioned that earlier. In general, the feeling is that the cost per bit of delivering a bit will be much lower, 20 times, 30 times lower than 4G. So that's the economic sort of argument for 5G in this mode, another G mode. And I think in the US, we deployed many, many cities. I do know in Chicago, but there are several others. Fixed wireless access is actually considered to be a very important use case. In the United States, because of cable and DSL really don't deliver that much. You want gigabit, like I have at home, thanks to fiber, you're not going to get it from those technologies. So wireless can do it for you. So this is becoming pretty important use case, and I think we're rolling out fixed wireless also in the United States. We have, in fact, in Dallas. So it delivers gigabit speed, so it's remarkably high speeds. It'll do it to a CPE terminal. We are outside sometimes. We cannot get a good range. Otherwise, hopefully inside on the kitchen table or near the window. Verizon and AT&T are rolling out in the US. But you can't have too many trees. Foliage is a problem for these bands. So you want to avoid heavy foliage. And there's already, because there's a big demand for gigabit access to home, there are other companies like WeLink, which I'm involved with, also trying to do similar stuff at 60 gigahertz. So it's not true 5G, but there's a lot happening here now. So fixed wireless access, I think in 10 years from now, most of you will get gigabit, and it'll be wireless in your home. So where are the phone subscriber thing? This is a chart from Canalys. So right now we are in 2019. I think there are 13 million phones. I think US may have very few, maybe 500,000. I think most of those phones are probably in China, where things are moving faster. But you can see as we go along, China will have certainly the largest population. So in another 3 years, China will have 263 million phones. I believe in China today, half the phones being sold today in China are 5G enabled. In the United States, it's much, much smaller. It's probably only 2 or 3%. So China has gone much faster into 5G. So North America and others will be there. So this will. So at some point, this will start eroding into. I think LTE will keep growing. I think 5G will really start eroding for the LTE growth only about 5-6 years from now. For right now, 4G still is the growth phase. So what about equipment? And there have been lots of discussion in US and in China and in India about who manufactures whom and what are the vulnerabilities and so on and so forth. So the dominant vendor for 5G infra is Huawei. And of course, this number is 2023. I think it won't happen. But 2023, Huawei may be in a bigger trouble than this. Today, they are the dominant. I think it's typically similar as follows. Ericsson is smaller. Nokia is even smaller. And then lots of others. There is ZTE from China and a little bit from Samsung, which is used in India, for example. And there are others too, NEC in Japan and so on and so forth. But Huawei is the leader and certainly put a lot of investment into technology. I have a fairly good understanding of the competitive values of these three guys, but I can't share that here. And this is on the RAN side, that's the radio network. There's also the core network, it's called EPC, which is where the core, where all the boxes lie, doing your handovers and all that. So you'll notice there's no US companies in this layer, which is very unfortunate. We don't have any companies in the United States in the RAN side. All the companies that we had have somehow died or been absorbed by other foreign companies. With the RAN on the EPC core side, we still have Cisco. We have a few other smaller companies, but again, Ericsson, Huawei, Nokia are the three big players, and Cisco has a role too. With respect to handsets, it's now largely US. Apple has still not come out. Still not gotten. They'll do it fairly soon, I think. But ZTE And Huawei, ZTE, I think, are the dominant, but in US, they are blocked, so LG and Samsung are sold in US. Also Xiaomi, another Chinese company. And I was mentioning, for half the phones sold in China, may not be today, but certainly by January will be 5G enabled. That's an amazing, amazing achievement. So what about the other part of the non-G part of 5G, IoT, low latency, ultra fabric? That's actually the more interesting part. And it's going to impact many, many things. So it's just a buzz cloud. Let's talk about, what about deployments of this part? This is going to be phase 2 and phase 3, the IoT part and the ultra reliable part. I put it at 21 and 22. This is a report in India. I think this is going to get pushed out a little bit more. And I'll explain why so. This is much harder to do than in 5G. For the eMBB part, it's just another phone. People understand what it means and what it brings. But here we're treading into new areas, so it's going to be slower than we think. So what are the barriers here? Lots of use cases. Mostly new use cases need to be built. We talk about things loosely, but I'm on board of some companies where we find it takes a long, long time to penetrate, make things happen. So first of all, it's a new class of devices and applications. So everything is new, so it takes time to get it done. It also simply often customized. You build one, for example, Samsung builds half the phones in Vietnam. Just by the way, Vietnam this year will be, I think, doing something like more than 100 billion phones, $100 billion of phones. So half the phones are built in Vietnam. They sell it all over the world. But when you do IoT and all that, it's highly specific to a particular box, a particular country. It's much more customized. So it's not that scalable. And often what I notice from my board positions is that it's difficult to push these things into industries because you've got to change so many processes within the system. There's a lot of resistance, so it takes time to adopt. So this part, however promising, is going to take time because there's many more barriers affecting its. And so we talk a little bit about one thing the series is all about, is the mobile edge computing. So what's mobile edge computing? Basically, instead of taking all your data back to the cloud, you would put a box nearby, and then from data from where it sources from, you would go to the edge, which means the local box. You would do some processing there, and then you will still, of course, talk to the cloud, but you will do much bigger things there. And so, what is the big role of MEC? Well, latency. Already, 5G will take us eventually to about 1 millisecond latency on the air. Today, it's about 10 to 20 milliseconds. But you don't want then go to 200 miles to a cloud point. You want to be able to get to within 50 feet to where it can be processed, or you can be served. So low latency is critical for making 5G low latency useful. So edge is much of that. Second thing, data localization. People who don't want data to leave a premises, a university, or a factory. So by processing data locally, it gives. And also there's a security element to this is linked to localization. You don't want data to be exposed to outsiders. And more and more data is being used, consumed, extracted, worked on with analytics, and you go back and feed the system back and react to it. You want that fast turnaround, whether it's in a store or whether it's in a factory. All this MEC makes sense. So we'll see a lot of lectures in the series which will expand on these ideas. IoT, this has been long in coming. I think we've been talking about IoT for more than 10 years. And again, it's been slow to develop. It's been most hockey sticks still haven't happened. The reason for that is what I mentioned before, because these things tend to get embedded heavily into the processes of systems, and it's not easy to change things. So it'll take time, but there's lots of already current players. Bluetooth is there, there's LoRa, there's Zigbee, and in your home, you have all these things in your home anyway. So 5G is a new player on the block, but it tends to be outdoor focused. A lot of indoor stuff is going on, which 5G won't touch really. And the definition of what 5G will do is being done at release 16. It'll get done by December 2020. So what is 5G going to do in IoT is to pay much more attention to battery conservation. The idea today is, most of you have sensors in your home, and you have to change the battery every 3 months. idea of 5G is to put a button battery and use it for 10 years. That requires lots of very clever ideas. So 5G brings a lot of cleverness into it. The main idea is to sort of make things sleep as much as possible, just wake them up exactly for the little bit to get the data out of them. So that requires lots of orchestration. So 5G will bring, not so much in the air interface, but in the scheduling part, lots of very smart things. So I think 5G will be a big player in IoT, but it's going to take time. What about AI? Well, you can't escape AI being at Stanford. But one is the AI is increasingly used in delivering 5G fabric. And it turns out, for example, already AI is coming in. I'm not talking about Siri, the AI is coming in into making the wireless links work better or make scheduling work better. It's just in the layer 1, layer 2, AI has begun to play a role. In fact, there's a conference within 10 days in Europe, which I'm going to be speaking at, talking a little bit about those issues. It's also coming into infrastructure to make infrastructure easier to debug or easier to install, optimize. And then, of course, the global level, when all the networks come together, we can do lots of optimization across networks. So AI is enabling 5G, and it's really never played a role in 4G. So 5G, it's begun to play a role, and I'm surprised to see the amount of progress made. There's a lot of remarkable progress made in the lower level, which I'm aware of. It's pretty remarkable. And of course, AI will also enable many things. It's basically a fabric which will bring in AI applications, and then of course bring in lots of new industries, and we know all about that. So AI has two roles in thing. I think both those are beginning, but I'm pretty surprised to see how well it's already doing at the bottom layer there. Manufacturing, yes. Again, there's wireless has many benefits. Much more location flexibility. You can move things around. Most of us, I remember when I did my companies, we would wire the entire company for internet access. You don't do that anymore. So you get rid of wiring, and of course they have to be extremely super reliable and low latency to make sure these things work properly. Much more reconfigurable, better analytics, integration analytics, and MEC analytics. So this is something called Industry 4.0, where AI will be a big AI, MEC, and all that will be use the 5G fabric to transform industry. And I think there's lots of promise here, but it's still out in the future. It's not mainstream as yet. And then, of course, vehicle to anything, intelligent transportation. Certainly, safety will be a big part of it. Reducing congestion, smart routing. We're seeing already a little bit in 4G, but it will become much bigger. In fact, there was an effort in Stanford, which I was part of, where we were looking at 4G for doing this sort of things. But finally, 4G never embraced it properly. So 5G will embrace this properly in their standards. Energy efficiency, autonomous driving, whenever that happens. But there are also other standards in play called DSRC and IEEE. So 5G is not the only player. So it's got to muscle in seeing whether all the investments happening here will actually stay, or 5G will take over is not entirely clear. And so summary, so we'll be in service for another 15 years minimum. I would even say 40. But it's going to take time to mature, maybe 6 to 7 years before we see all the applications visible. Deployment of mobile and fixed services just beginning. Probably in US, maybe just a couple of million customers. Maybe in the United States, in China, a little bit more. And the real potential 5G lies in services enabled by MTC, mobile machine-to-machine communications, and low latency and ultra reliability. That's the big area. I think, I remember giving a talk at the Indian Mobile Congress last year. I said, only 1% of eventual 5G applications are now visible. A lot of it is ahead. Many of you can start companies to make that happen. In 2005, when I was actually busy with WiMAX, but WiMAX and 4G and LTE are very similar, we had no understanding of all this will happen. There was no understanding. So all that's came in the last 10 years. So we'll be surprised at what world will do with 5G, but we still cannot see it. And so with that, I will end and take a few questions.
Great, thank you.
Because with an increasingly connected world and a little bit of a lax thought about security,
Right.
it seems like every day we're just hearing about banks and other institutions that are compromised.
I have, somewhat jaded to security. I said, almost a lot of the stuff we have today is pretty good. Unless we build quantum computers and of course they break down. Much of the problem of security really is human beings who don't follow processes. From one laptop to industrial people. So it's really human failures which actually bring all the vulnerabilities. But there is apparently there's some elements of security has many dimensions. But there's always this worry saying that data can be leaked out of a network, sort of forked out, and this is always the dark accusations against Huawei. So Huawei could be doing it, not that we have shown anything as yet. So the question is, are there ways of protecting that and detecting that? There's actually a committee sitting on it. I think Stanford is involved with it, Guru Parulkar and Open Lab. So there's some attempt to try and bring some more thinking around that problem of forking data. Otherwise, much of security failures is the failures of human beings. Why is 5G talked about security so much is that 5G will, instead of touching, today 4G touches 4 billion people, 5G will touch a trillion things. So the opportunities for things going wrong is much more. So obviously, the system must find a way by which bad practices or sloppiness is controlled. It's usually sloppiness that creates problems. How do you actually detect and stop it? So I think that will be the challenge. I think otherwise, our encryption and all authentication, all that are pretty good.
So I want to ask about the cost of developing the infrastructure for 5G. Because if you're developing, especially the high band 5G, where you have to have cell towers every 200 or 300 meters, that's a huge amount of cost. How can that be covered?
Covered, yeah. So I think the issue always is the market. You will build it, you're going to build it either hoping that you will recover your cost because there's enough offtake from it. And so I think that's the play everybody has. Certainly in LTE, I can tell you the same issues showed up 10 years ago, saying LTE cells are smaller because we're using wider bandwidth. Whenever we use wider bandwidth, this MIMO helps a lot, but it still never fully does it. In 2G, I remember in GSM, you couldn't have 10 kilometer cells. It shrunk to 1 kilometer at LTE, and everybody said that's not going to work. Now it's going to go to 200 meters. So I think it's a question of making sure there's enough application to pull revenue and get customers to pay for it. So that's a dance that we'll have to see how it plays. I think so far, we've never been disappointed. Sure.
You first, and then you. Okay.
So in terms of the policy world, certainly in the case of Europe and in other countries like Australia and New Zealand, there's concerns about Chinese 5G operation in what they call the core versus the non-core. Could you just walk us through the technical differences and whether or not, as the European perspective, is if we put them in the non-core, then that's not a security risk. Do you agree with that, Stanford?
Yeah, the issue there is that the radios, the beamformers, radios, even the physical layer, they're all pretty dumb. They're not really a source of getting data. Now, I think the real stuff is when the data gets into the core, that's where a lot of manipulation takes place, and also where it connects to the outside world. So all the vulnerabilities are sitting inside the core, and that's where mischief can be done. The edge is the edge in wireless is fundamentally the radio part, and they are likely to be much better behaved. So generally, the view of today is that in Europe is that if you're worried about entity or country technology, bring them into the edge. They're not going to do that much damage, but don't bring them into the core till you're more certain that things are okay. So that's a philosophy going on in Europe.
So in this case, is core really a layer of the technology stack?
No. Core is just where you have all these boxes.
Okay.
The variety of boxes in the core network 4G deals with subscriber identity, including billing, all those sort of boxes.
Okay.
There.
Okay.
So you mean the radio access network is really
The radio access network is the dumb network. They're not considered to be vulnerable. It's where you actually, when you start manipulating the data, moving it around, and connect to the outside world, that's where your vulnerability is going to come. So keep, so obviously that's in Europe is saying that it will be safe to bring, not to bring suspicious players into the core now.
Okay, and core would include from the tower into the cloud.
Yeah, the core from the tower today, the way it's going to work is from the tower you only have a radio, nothing more.
Right.
Then you pull it back on what's called ORAN, and then you come into a big server farm where everything gets done. All the core functions get done. Some of the radio part gets done. Some of the processing layer 2 gets done, and that's where you connect to the outside world. It's there. The potential of vulnerabilities arise there.
Okay.
So you want to, if you're worried about those issues, use companies you trust there. But radio side is less this thing. There's a little bit of angle to it. It turns out there is the NSA is non-standalone. Non-standalone means your 5G connections also requires a 4G connection. So in non-standalone mode, you're going to continue to use your current LTE core. It's called the EPC core. It's already there, and if you're happy with it, it's safe, it's safe. So you can actually roll out 5G in NSA mode without touching the current core, which is already safe. Therefore, that's the way people are going. Once you go to SA mode, then the core have to be changed, and then you have decisions about those issues.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, your market share slide showed that the U.S. companies missed the boat on 5G. Why is that, and what are the kind of policy implications for the government for 6G?
So first of all, on the infrastructure side, we have really no play. I mean, there's my small companies, but no real play. But on the phone side, the chips inside your phones, the 5G phones, will still have Qualcomm NR radio, and will have Broadcom chips. So on the phone side, we are fairly strong, but China has pretty much similar strengths. But on the infra side, we are virtually zero. The problem, I mean, let's not talk about China, but United States, we had Nortel, which is a U.S.-Canadian company. They made some terrible mistakes during the 2000 internet rule, and then they deserved to die, and then they died. Then we had Lucent, which unfortunately didn't quite work out, so it merged with Alcatel, and that didn't work out. Then they merged with Nokia. So now Lucent's original footprint, so U.S. footprint of Nokia is pretty small now. So it's become really a Finnish company. So I think in comparison, I would say to China, China, I think, played its cards much better, and I mean, I won't go into the details. I mean, some of them, but fundamentally, Huawei now is probably investing something like $15 billion of R&D a year in 5G. Nothing like that happening in this country. So we have to step up and do something about it.
So I also want to follow up on that, because the standards organizations behind 5G are international, and they're technically industry rather than government, correct? Now, in that situation, if the U.S. has such a small share of the market in regard to 5G equipment and so forth, does that reduce American technology's kind of contribution to the next generation?
It's already happened. In 5G, I think something like, I could be wrong, but the dominant number of SEPs is standard essential patents, is with Huawei. Dominant, and I think it may be as much as 50%. So everybody else is looking for that. Ericsson, Intel, all the guys are playing on the little than 50%. So Huawei has become the dominant owner of intellectual property. We have a real vulnerability here. In fact, you go into the Senate building, you find everybody wants to know what we're going to do. But there is a huge concern in the United States saying it's such a fundamental fabric of the country. We need to do something. We don't have a player.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, Question about the future of service providers.
Future of?
Service providers.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, your point about 1% of applications actually being visible today was fascinating. New business models are coming, and do you think AT&T and T-Mobile are the ones to roll this out, or are there other entrants that will come in?
That's a good question. And I think, I'm a little bit involved with this issue at the governmental level. The thing is that 1, 2, 3, 4G for phones, 5G, the phone part looks similar, and service providers know what they're doing. They can make things work. But the other pieces are very new. And I don't think the current service providers really know this stuff well enough. They don't have the linkages into industry. So in general, my view is that there's an opportunity for new type of service providers, including some of these networks will be private networks. For example, a big factory will have its own network and its own sort of, so there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for new service providers with different business models to enter into the non-G part of 5G. And I'm actually skeptical whether AT&T and all these current companies will be able to move there quickly enough. I think unlikely, I think.
So if they don't, do you see companies that are likely to move?
I think, we can do startups and figure that out. But I must say that this second part, the non-G part, is going to take some time to boil because it's got, I've seen my own stuff, how difficult it is to bring them in because of all these process changes and all that. Yeah. But they will, my opinion, there's a lot of, I think even in Europe, there's a lot of talk of saying how do you invent new business models which are better tuned to that business, and maybe the bigger guys are not really going to do it. It's not clear.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I think the very key topic is the edge computing. So edge computing systems, there will be hundreds of millions of edge computing. So in this form, what I've observed is you said they are very highly customized, and it also means that the market is segmented. So is there any kind of like a open hardware or open instrument level of this kind of make this market in a more open source like movement that, or is there any community there that can drive this? Because right now, for example, Ethernet for data centers, the high speed data centers, the market field right now talk about 100G, 400, even future 800G. Right now, the solutions or whatever to building those core fiber network is already quite segmented. So I'm concerned about also same true for every enabling device in the edge computing. So is there any way that there's a community that's focused on this open hardware or whatever for 5G?
So for people who couldn't hear, because I know that it's hard to hear sometimes in the hall, you were talking about really open source or open standards for hardware in the networks. Usually you talk about open source software, but you're really talking about hardware compatibility, or what do you mean by openness here?
Here, the reason behind this, for example, so 5G, first of all, is this software or protocol layer, which you have open communication protocol or whatever. It's also because there is a massive, internet IoT thing, which means if the market is segmented, you have this customized solution, you have that customized solution, eventually, you will find it's very hard to manage.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a very profound question, and I want to spend a little time with it. First of all,
yeah, I'm not close to edge computing, but if you, one is on the hardware side, I've seen people actually trying to put these edge, there's nothing more than just a server with some terabyte of memory actually into APs now, wireless APs. So all sort of things are happening there, putting these boxes, because the big part of edge computing is to find power for it. So you already have something using power, it's easy to push them in there. But with respect to a point I think Professor Dasha was talking about was really what about the interface protocols and standardization there so that boxes can mix and match. I think probably, I'm not really sure. Most probably this will be taken up by industry consortiums and try and come up with voluntary standard. there's a lot happening, I'm not close to it.
Actually, the way I want to follow up with this is, do you see the international communications situation breaking down into different regional factions so that a 5G phone here will not work somewhere else?
You know, I think the big Berlin Wall is going to be, if, you know, it's an Indo-China, US-China issue. And so there were, I see lots of dangers there, because if China is pushed out of the standards and all this activity, they're going to create their own ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that's not good for anybody. But that's a couple of layers of pay scale above my level, so I won't comment on it.
Although I am kind of impressed just from your presentation. So different frequencies in different countries.
Right.
And so the telephones already have to have antennas that can cope with all of these different frequencies. And now you may have different kinds of protocols that they have to have different chipsets. And I remember the old days when American versions of networks didn't match the European GSM.
Yes.
And that was bad enough. But I really wonder if this is going to be a huge issue with 5G because the complexity is so much more.
Well, China probably is eating a little bit of its own cake, because some years ago it built something called TD-SCDMA, which I was a little bit involved with. And then they forced anybody selling phones to have that stuff and put a penalty on everyone. And now the shoe's on the other foot now for them.
I see. They've pulled back. Okay. Next. Go ahead.
So I used to work in the smart metering and connected home space. Thank you for your lecture.
Yeah.
I used to work in the smart metering and the connected
Sure.
home space. The two issues we had was the latency of the connected home in actually implementing something that you do, and the metering, the cost of 5-second or 3-second data actually being utilized over the cloud to actually enable decision making to make a smarter grid. From your presentation, it looks like with the costs are going to get down to 1/20th of what they are today with 5G. That's going to happen in the next 10 years or so. What is the right time for a new company to start designing products for these ecosystems where the proliferation of the network is strong enough so that your timing is appropriate rather than be too early or be too late? I'd love your feedback.
Well, those are difficult questions. But when I mentioned the 20x reduction in cost per bit, I was talking about really phone services. For phones, because the bit will come down, I think the cost per bit may not be the right metric in case of IoT, the stuff you're talking about. There may be other metrics there. And certainly, battery, longevity, you don't want to be changing batteries too often. And security, there may be other drivers there. But my own sense is that there's going to be a huge opportunity now. And a lot of things are happening, and a lot more things will happen.
But just to clarify, the bandwidth requirements of IoT tend to
Very
be
small.
much smaller. So can you, in some ways, trade off one against the other?
Meaning?
Battery life versus bandwidth, or latency versus...
Yeah, bandwidth always, unfortunately, costs power. But some of these things don't require much power, much data to send. And therefore, you don't need much bandwidth. So I think the tricks about low power is really the scheduling things. That is, when IoT really has something to send, some sense event, it must get access to the network. If it actually, the way today a phone does it, it actually sends a rack request. There's millions of bytes take place before the phone can actually talk. IoT can't afford all that. So there's the system called, there's some techniques called SCMA and what is the other one?
Simple round robin, does it work?
No, round robin is too wasteful because you'll keep on touching people who don't want to talk.
Yeah,
so you really want to.
So many devices you'll come around only very rarely.
So there are some new techniques, and it's my other talk. But there are new ideas by which somebody wants to send only 5 bits for once in a day at some random time. It can do it very, very efficiently. And that doesn't work today in the current network. 4G doesn't allow that. 5G has got some mechanisms by which these guys can get in the system and actually talk and get out. So all the 5G IoT, it's all about power reduction, really.
Back in the back.
If I heard you accurately a moment ago, you're saying that if it's text, not video, that there would be a possibility of servicing billions of hits, but most of the billions of hits and requests are for video, which is the bandwidth problem,
Right.
to this other gentleman's comment.
Right.
And that's what they're
So-
saying
so-
may slow down the 5G.
I would agree. I mean, so cameras are, are a different animal. So they can't send a few bits and be quiet and be happy. So cameras, yes, cameras will be a use case for 5G where you do need bandwidth. But I think I would think most cameras today, we do get cameras which are battery operated, but you got to change the battery, those big batteries every 2 months. Most cameras will be wired, so their power may not be that important for them.
Or any
Before-
subsidized content. That's-
Yeah, before we go too much further with this, I do want to put in a plug for future weeks in the course, because we have somebody who will be talking about autonomous vehicles in a couple of weeks. We've got a panel later on in the quarter. We've got a panel talking about highly interactive edge devices like AR and games, because this is both video as well as extreme low latency is required. So we'll come back to these issues. Go ahead.
Just to follow on the low power issue, is it going to be, is 5G going to be more power efficient than, say, NB-IoT, which is specifically designed for IoT applications?
Yeah, so I think I would think when you say power efficiency, I'm not talking about the efficiency of the infrastructure. That is, 5G has something called massive MIMO, and massive MIMO is supposed to be green. It means for every bit it transmits, it uses less power because beamforming, better focusing, and all that. So I'm talking about the device at the other end. I think a lot of the power savings in these devices come from very intelligent protocols and very scalable bandwidth. Somebody wants to send only a few bits. They don't need to talk on a 5G may have up to 100 megahertz channels or 200 megahertz channels. That would be impossible for them to talk on that. They're going to talk on a few hertz channel. 5G has all this flexibility to deploy much narrower channels, much better scheduling, wake-up times, and so lots of intelligence there. So I think the sheer, I know thousands of people participate. I think 5G will have the best ideas to try and increase battery life. Go ahead.
My question relates to pricing of spectrum. I know it will be auction, but how does one set a reserve price?
Yeah, so it's a complicated issue. Japan, we sell it give it for free. It's called beauty contest. I think the disease of auctioning spectrum started from the United States, and a way of making money. Typically, I know a little bit more India. The problem is that if you have an auction, people really can't see the future, and sometimes they overbid, and that kills the company. Companies have died in India because they overbid on the spectrum. It's happened here in the US also. And so on the other hand, you don't want to, giving free may not work in the United States, but so you want to put a base price. If that base price is too low, there may be some collusion. So there are experts in Stanford who spend their whole life worrying about how to do it correctly. But there is no silver bullet in. After all, spectrum is public. It's a public space, and it should be used for the public good. The question is, how do you do it right? I think there's no good way to do it. Every country finds its own way, and India, where I'm a little bit involved with policy, I think we're still figuring out, because the current base price, I think, that we're offering in India to the carriers saying, no, we're not going to bid, it's just too high. And the question is, do you lower it, in which case the public exchequer won't get the money, so it's complicated.
What about the number of operators issue?
That's a big problem in India, as you know, you probably know what's going on. We used to have 6, 7 operators, now there are 3, of which only 1 is running the show. The other 2 are some level of distress. Yeah. So even the US is in better shape. We have at least 3 big guys, and they're pretty good. We need that competition. Yeah.
Got one last question for you.
Sure.
So when I see on my cell phone using AT&T's service, it's claiming that I've got 5G.
Yeah. So, that's marketing. And there's no 5G in the Bay Area.
Thank you. I wanted to be clear on that. Thanks very much.